A Man Called Aloud by Barry Gottehrer. Not all the men I was going to be dealing with would come down to City Hall and walk into my office. Some of the people we wanted were so inaccessible local task forces officers weren't able to get through to them. Some of these leaders had given up on city government altogether, and some had grand ideas. They would talk to Mayor Lindsay, directly or to no one. I set out to convince them that I spoke for the mayor and that it was worth their while to deal with me. High on the list of priorities was Clarence Smith Jowers, born in Danville, Virginia, 41 years before, whose police record included time for gambling, felonious assault, narcotics, resisting arrest, weapons, and one charge I never did get the straight story on, turning over a garbage can. After leaving the Harlem Mosque during Malcolm X's period of leadership there, Clarence 13X Smith surfaced once again as the head of a sect similar to the Muslims, which he named the Five Percenters, and he renamed himself Allah. In 1964, a white shopkeeper and his wife had been murdered in their store on 125th Street, and a group of young men, identified as Five Percenters, had been arrested and charged with the brutal slayings. In these pre-Panther days, no group struck fear into whites more than the Five Percenters. Allah and his group had a reputation for being unreachable, anti-white criminals, and these qualities were exactly the ones that interested me. The police had told us that if we could reach him, we would really be doing something. The police knew Allah. They put him at the top of their list of dangerous militants in New York City. Jim Lawson also knew Allah and asked him to set up a meeting. It took a lot of persuading. I wasn't about to pay Lawson off, so I kept talking to him. We had a drink now and again. And finally, he set up a meeting in an unlikely spot, the Hotel Roosevelt, on May 11th. No one showed except Lawson. He was embarrassed and apologetic and set up another meeting for the next day on his home territory, a bar in Harlem called the Glamour Inn. He set the time for 3 p.m. and he told me to come alone. When I arrived on 127th Street and 7th Avenue, I didn't think the Glamour Inn was much to look at. A long, thin room with an air conditioner that didn't work. It was drab enough to discourage the few customers who might show up there. It did not seem like one of the better bars in Harlem. Lawson was late. The bar was virtually deserted except for a couple of men, one of them answering Allah's description, seating several bar stools away from me. I picked up my drink, a rum and coke, and moved over to introduce myself. Allah was with his main man, James Howard, who was at the time calling himself Jesus. And there I was, a white man, overdressed in a jacket and tie, sitting having a drink between Allah and Jesus. Not long after we started talking, Jesus said to me, "If you want, I'll show you a real good time. Any kind of woman you want, all the women you want. I'll take you to all the places. It'll cost you $100. I ordered another drink and told Jesus I hadn't come to the Glamour Inn for that kind of assistance. Allah's speech pattern was uniquely his own, with his own pitch and rhythm. He would start a sentence, "I am neither pro-black nor anti," and then he would pause. He had a stretching the emphasis on that last syllable. He explained his religion to me at some length. The world, he believed, was inhabited by three types of people. 85% of the world are cattle, 10% of the devils who misled the cattle, and 5%, with Allah as at its head, had become the Five Percenters. Much of the theology was similar to the Muslim teachings. When Allah left the mosque, he took a good number of books and pamphlets with him to guide his new sect. I never found out why he split with the Muslims, as former members were never discussed. From what I learned later, it was likely he violated the rules against drinking and gambling. At the time I met Allah, his followers numbered either from 2 to 500, if you believe the police reports, or 800, if you believed Allah. I've been told that sooner or later he could try to start some kind of armed revolution and that the Five Percenters would try to take over Harlem. But Allah wasn't sounding like a revolutionary. He was asking me if the city could provide enough buses to take the Five Percenters on a picnic, and I thought it would be possible. Then he asked about the school facilities, the Urban League, which used corporate funding to staff storefront street academies for dropouts with teachers who were former dropouts themselves, told Allah they weren't willing to give over a street academy for the exclusive use of Five Percenters. Allah wanted the city to do better by him. Allah held that all men were Allah and had divine qualities. Through education, these qualities would be revealed. Since each person is Allah, each is qualified to teach as well as learn. Much of the material the 5% teaches himself concerns the mystical relationships of numbers, of letters, of ancient names and symbols. The Bronx, he told me, was truly named Medina. No wonder Allah and the Urban League had some differences. He spun out enough incomplete thoughts and non sequiturs to convince me he was half crazy, only to slip in an insight or an argument that changed my mind. By now, the bar was filling up. We had been talking for about an hour and a half. Gamblers, pimps, drug dealers at different levels in the drug world's hierarchy were filling up the booths and standing around the bar. They wore dashikis and afro hairstyles, some of them. Others were tricked out in the flashiest multicolored clothes, in jumpsuits, in lame shirts, in tight pants, and tall boots. The mood picked up. There was a neighborhood feeling here that I liked, which I tried to understand. Aloud invited me to the monthly gathering of the 5 percenters, which they called their parliament, to explain about the proposed picnics and the possibilities of the school I accepted for the last Sunday in May. All the time we talked, my mind kept drifting back to the police report on Aloud. It didn't go together. I began to wonder if I was talking to the right man. Allah's sidekick, Jesus, who for some unexplained reason later changed his name to Justice, was a fine-looking man with white hair. He didn't fit either. When I asked how we'd get in touch, Allah gave me the number of the 2 payphones at the Glamour Inn, and I wrote them on a matchbook, promising I might call him within the week. Then we ended our conversation as Allah had begun, with a handshake and the assurance, peace. The next few days brought me back a piece of luck. I learned the city owned a building with a storefront 5 doors from the Glamour Inn, and they had taken it over in a tax case. The store was closed. I called Eugene Callender, who ran the Urban League then, and now runs the New York Urban Coalition, and we arranged for the League to run a street academy for 5 percenters. The city would turn over the storefront to the League for $1 a year if they would supply 2 teachers. On the last Sunday in May, I was ready to attend the 5 percenters parliaments held on the top of Mount Morris Park from 12 noon until evening. The police had told me the parliament usually attracted between 100 and 200 people. They kept their eye on them, but from a distance. When the group was meeting, only black policemen would be sent anywhere near the area. They would advise against a white man going up there at all. Sandy Gerlich was so concerned about my safety, he insisted I walk over there with 2 policemen, both black. One was a plainclothesman and the other was Cal Boxley, a lieutenant in uniform. Remembering my discomfort at the Glamour Inn, I did not wear a jacket and tie, but was dressed in a t-shirt and slacks. When I went to the park, which interrupts 5th Avenue between 120th and 124th Streets, and walked up the long, winding circular steps to a clear area at the very top around an old landmark lookout tower where 5 percenters from all the 5 boroughs were now assembling. From that high point, you can see all of New York City spread out below. I also saw winos up there, relocated for the afternoon, staggering off with their bottles in brown bags, broken cheap wine bottles, and used drug paraphernalia. Allah was up there with his friend Jesus, or Justice, Al Murphy, another man who hung out at the Glamour Inn, and almost 200 young 5 percenters, all of them black. The meeting opened with a ritual greeting, peace, and Allah gave a combination speech and sermon about their mission to take care of their own, live clean, and civilize the world. It wasn't a new speech, but the 5 percenters would chime in with key words or phrases. The young people, who ranged in age from 8 to 9 years old to 25, with a handful of older people, stood in a circle and took turns stepping forward to make a short speech. Most of the boys wore small African hats that looked like square Jewish yarmulkes. There was a great many young girls, most with small babies pulling at their skirts or held in their arms. Few were married. Allah believed that one for the 5 percenters to inherit the earth was to produce more children than any other group and outpopulate the competition. I was introduced and stepped into the center of the circle to speak my piece. Lieutenant Boxley, the plainclothesman whose identity was no secret from the 5 percenters, faded into periphery. I explained that the mayor was interested in working with the organization and they'd be able to get them buses to the beach in Long Island at one of the state parks. We settled on 8 a.m. departure the following Sunday, and I told them some of the plans for the street academy. When I was finished, there was silence. No one believed a thing I said. When I went back to the Glamour Inn with Allah, he was polite, but I could see he didn't believe me either. The next Sunday morning, I was at 127th Street an hour ahead of time. Although I had reconfirmed all the arrangements myself, I was very relieved when at 10 minutes to 8, the first buses pulled around the corner from 7th Avenue. We filled 6 buses and headed for the beach at Long Island State Park. The Citizens Summer Committee had a commitment from Restaurant Associates, one of the better chains in the city, to provide us with free food for different poverty groups over the summer. I filled my city car with their sandwiches and followed the buses to the picnic grounds. Allah once told me that the 5%ers, like Muslims, would eat no product of the pig. He described the pig as 1/3 dog, 1/3 rat, and 1/3 cat. Now, he wound up with a flourish. Would you eat dog, rat, or cat? With this in mind, when we were almost at the picnic grounds, I pulled over to take a look at the lunches in the back of my car. I opened up one sandwich bag, American cheese and sliced ham. I took out the ham and rewrapped the sandwich. I checked another bag and found more ham. 300 bags, each with 2 sandwiches per child, meant 600 sandwiches. The job took 2 hours, and by the end of it, I was fast enough to work for McDonald's. Allah told me that the buses for the picnic weren't so important to him. He was more interested in learning whether I would keep my word. On the street, that was all that mattered. You might be a pimp, a thief out on bail, or hiding from the police, but you'd still deal straight in the community if you wanted to keep your self-respect and if you wanted others to respect you. Word, said Allah, pausing for his followers to add their last phrase with him, is bond. Passing the street test with the buses gained me Allah's confidence, although most of his friends still had some doubts about me. I took to spending 3 or 4 nights a week at the Glamour Inn. I'd leave word that I could be reached on those 2 payphones. Although I like to drink, I cut down to a few rum and coke each night to clear my mind in case of causing trouble. So we would drink for a while, and then Allah and justice would move outside in the streets to gamble, where I stood around and watched or talked with people. I'm not a gambler myself. I shot craps once or twice in the streets to see what it was like. Allah would go home to his wife or one of his more recently acquired common-law wives, and I would hang out with Al Murphy, a street hustler and a gambler 5 or 6 years younger than I. He had been in and out of trouble, mostly for gambling. The first time Allah had introduced us at the bar, we happened to discover that we shared the same birthday, and that was the beginning of a strong bond between us. He was easygoing, a good-looking man with a mustache and a beard and a ready smile. Murphy and I used to spend time at the after-hours joints in the neighborhood, drinking, watching, talking, meeting people, trying to convince them that Lindsay cared, that riots would hurt the poor far more than the rich, seeking their help should we ever need to restore order. It became my block. There was a bar in the corner, the Wellworth, that I didn't patronize often. It was a rough bar several notches below the Glamour Inn. Right next to it was the empty storefront that would become the 5%ers Street Academy. There was a couple of shops, a hairdresser, a fish place. The Glamour Inn was in the middle of the block. It was not a money bar. The barmaids came and worked for a while and then moved on because no one other than a few drug dealers tipped very well. They served no food. Someone would bring in some fried fish from next door or store chicken from across the street and pass it around the bar. Someone always had a quarter for the jukebox. There weren't many fights in the Glamour Inn, and you didn't often see knives. It helped that crowd of 5%ers was usually hanging on the street. They served as a junior-sized bouncer when Allah was inside. An after-hours place was right above in the same building, and there were a couple more across the street. The after-hours places typically had one room where people shot crap, another playing cards. You found liquor there and a variety of drugs. This is where you came after the bars closed. The hookers would turn up here after they finished work, and the numbers people. It took me time to get to know people here and build up information network to prevent disorders and contacts to work with should they occur. After people decided I wasn't an undercover cop, they figured I worked for the FBI. It was almost a year before I was accepted as somebody who belonged. If I didn't show up on a Friday night, people began to wonder what had happened to me. Bit by bit, Allah opened up with me. Although most stories emerged with many variations and some events were left shrouded in mystery. Much of what he told me he made up on the spot. He had been shot in the chest in 1965 during a crap game, staggered outside, and fell in the street, more than dead than alive. I could believe that, for Allah was constantly gambling and he was not a good loser. He kept himself surrounded by 5%ers, and when he lost, they would guerrilla the winners to get Allah's money back for him. Most people gambled Allah sooner or later had it in for him. He recovered from his wound and told people henceforth no one could kill him. He had been saved in order to lead his people. God brought me back to life to show his children the way, he said. The police did not agree. They arrested him in 1965 for overturning a garbage can. He was sent away to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. Allah never explained how one led to the other. He remained grateful to Mattawan for validating his status. They know I'm Allah, he told me. They gave me proof. He pulled out the wristband of his prison underwear to show the name Allah inked on it. This is my name at the hospital, he said. If they didn't believe I was Allah, why did they let me out? Would they let out a crazy person? After he told me this story, I called Mattawan and spoke to a doctor who remembered Aloud well, even though he'd been released several years before. The doctor had a heavy European accent. He said, "Oh, Allah, fascinating case." I said, "He told me that you support the fact that he's Allah since you let him out." The doctor burst out laughing. He thought Allah was very funny along the way he indicated that he also thought he was crazy. Sid Davidoff began to have his doubts about me. We went up to the Glamour Inn with me one night and I met Allah who was in rare form, less on cocaine than on his wit. When we left, Davidoff was shaking his head. "By choice," he was saying. "You actually come up here by choice. Anybody who likes to spend time with a guy like that has got to either be stupid or crazy, and I know you're not stupid." Early in the summer, before I knew Allah well enough to be at ease with him, I had a run-in with a man who claimed to be partially militant enemy. We got a word that he wanted to talk to Davidoff, and Sid and I met him in the evening at Wells, a chicken place in Harlem that stayed open all night. He had a fairly tough reputation, which I believed at the time. His head was shaved smooth, and he didn't smile very much. As soon as we sat down, he said, "I've been a nationalist since I was 10, a Muslim since I was 12, and a killer trained by the U.S. Army since I was 16. I know that this racist country is not going to change. I hate Jews, I hate whites, and I believe I have to kill both of you in the next 3 years." I thought that we might not get out of that restaurant alive. A gun could have easily been hit in the folds of his dashiki. Davidoff recovered first and broke the silence. He answered, "Okay, well that's 3 years from now. How can we work together until then?" The tension dissipated. It was one of Davidoff's finest moments. The days began to blur into nights. I spent more time in the streets meeting people, making contacts, and less in the office. If we were going to have trouble, I had a hunch it would be on the north of 96th Street, and indeed, most of the men on the police list were from that area. I was also going out to East New York, to Bedford-Stuyvesant, and all the poorest neighborhoods. I was spending time on the Lower East Side and going to the endless community meetings. Allah's Street Academy opened and took its first students. On the first day, somebody painted the number 7 on the door, symbolizing God and their numerology. The academic curriculum took a beating from the start, as the 5%ers had their own ideas. They believed that the most important thing to do is have knowledge of self, and as everybody is godly, so everybody is Allah. As a consequence, they felt free to reject as much as they accepted from the teachers the Urban League hired. Most of the young people had names like Be Allah or Wisdom Allah. When their leader was present, however, no one pressed the point. At those times, there was only one Allah. The 5%ers were probably no more dogmatic and extremely religious Jews or Catholics or fundamentalist Christians, but they were no less so, and eventually a different solution had to be found to the problem of their education. The kids attended different street academies, a few to each school, for their more conventional education, while Allah kept his storefront open as a place for kids to study their religion or just hang out. They were fairly successful at keeping drugs away from the place for the first few summers. It soon served as a neighborhood clubhouse for young people, and sometimes as a place for them to sleep. We organized more picnics and involved the 5%ers in summer programs. We were not disappointed when the media, hunting for some good copy for the militants, came upon Allah and began to quote his opinions. Instead of revolutionary rhetoric, he began handing out free commercials for the Lindsay administration. One excellent program the 5%ers took advantage of that summer was offered by the different airlines. They took kids from poor neighborhoods up on hour-long plane rides. Their route covered from 5 boroughs, Westchester County up into Connecticut and back. It was the first time the 5%ers had ever been on a plane. They were ecstatic. American Airlines ran some flights and had different Black and Puerto Rican personnel describe their jobs and offer assurances that there was a future in working for the airlines. Word of the plane trips and picnics spread. Young people came from all over to become 5%ers. And by the end of the summer, Allah's parliament had an attendance of 800 or 900. Allah was delighted, the police were delighted, and the kids got plane rides. The 5%ers designed their own insignia, a black numeral 7 and a star with a larger black and gold star. They asked me to get the design made into small pins and wear in their shirts and hang on a chain around their necks. There was resistance at this in City Hall. With an official medallion, who knows, they might start a recruitment drive. They might start a war. A medallion would give them legitimacy, the argument ran. I wasn't sure how one defined a group or how you took away the sense of themselves if they already had it, or whether it was useful to try. I got the pins made up, and the 5%ers did not start a war. As a matter of fact, some of the kids did commit crimes and some went to jail, but some got through school, and the most successful went through Harlem Prep. Right now, there's 20 or 35 5%ers enrolled in college. The first graduated in June. My friendship with the law ran very deep, but we spent our time together almost exclusively at the Glamour Inn. And on that block of 127th Street, Murphy used to call me his main man, which I took as a high compliment. Murphy described local customs, which because of the nature of my job, I was unaware. After the crap games began on the street every night at 5 or 6, the local police would drive up and park their car. The gamblers would walk over to give each policeman $5 a man, and the car would move on down the street, and the game would continue. When word got around that I was spending time on this particular block, the police would stay away. Murphy told me what had happened one night in a small cellar around the corner from the Glamour Inn off 7th Avenue. It was a dirty place, trash piled up in the corners, garbage cans tacked up by the boiler, rat poison in piles on the cement floor. Men used to come in from the streets there in bad weather or in winter, and they paid the super to look the other way. One night, 4 cops went in and found some 14 men shooting crap. One of the policemen upended a garbage can and banged on it with his club. He said, "Line up!" And then he called out, hear ye, court is now in session." He called the man to step up and asked, "How do you plead?" The man said, "Not guilty," and the cop banged on the garbage can. "That'll be $25. He went down the line. If a gambler didn't have $25, the cop cried out, "Guilty," and then brought them down to this precinct house. Murphy was sometimes my interpreter and sometimes my protector in touchy situations. One of the places we used to visit was an after-hour joint not far from the Apollo. It was a tiny place, very popular and always crowded. It was no bigger than a small living room. I figured either the police were unable to find it despite the Cadillacs double parked outside all night long, or they were being paid off. The place had 5 owners, one of whom was a policeman. He wasn't doing anything I thought particularly harmful, and we became friendly. He was running a place filled with people who could be useful to me in the event of a disturbance. It was a valuable contact point for me. I never saw the owner come to his place while on duty. I didn't see other policemen there at all until a black cop came in wearing his uniform. He walked over to talk to the woman who was attending bar and sat squeezed into the corner right next to me. He joked with her and passed a reefer around. He was introduced to me and we sat together for about 20 minutes. He was still smoking. Murphy knew him and finally took him on the side, and he said later, told the man he was embarrassing me and to get the hell out of there. I hadn't spent much time in Harlem before my definition of crime began to change. Someone like Aloud didn't kill people, and no dealings with me was he ever anti-white. The jails couldn't hold all the men who carried weapons in the poverty area of our cities. I began to differentiate among crimes. I never saw a policeman sell dope, and I know that I would have turned on him immediately. At the same time, I couldn't work much outrage up about marijuana. Heroin was something else. The people I knew were all trying to survive in different ways. They affected a lifestyle. I didn't see any violent crime, murders, or assaults. The people I knew were primarily engaged in victimless crimes, numbers, gambling, smoking dope, prostitution, that were part of the life in the streets. Sometimes the law took me aback. I couldn't get used to the young 5%ers, the girls who had children while themselves were still children, of 13 or 14. I didn't know what to make of that. Once Allah asked me to take his teenage daughter home with me for the night. He looked as if he thought it was a special favor. He was bestowing a gift on me. I turned him down, and later he apologized, but I wasn't quite sure we completely understood one another. By August, Allah was safely occupied with his street academy and converting new 5%ers, and I set out to meet another man with a terrible reputation, Charles Morris, also known as Charles Kenyatta. He headed a group called the Harlem Mau Mau's. The police and the press, which gave him considerable coverage, assumed that a group of a name like that was preparing a massacre. After my experience with the law, I was more skeptical of police judgment, but even so, it was hard to gauge Kenyatta's following. I guessed that he had a great many sympathizers, but the active membership may have numbered no more than 10. What the active membership was prepared to do, I had no idea, but Kenyatta's power came less from the Mau Mau's than from his skillful use of media. He would get on the 6 p.m. news and declare that the Mau Mau's were going to Park Avenue and white people would panic. In a potential to riot situation, strength in the media can be as damaging as if somebody's shock troops trained and hidden north of 96th Street. By now, I was enough at ease in Harlem to make a date with Kenyatta without Lawson along to make the introduction. I met him in La Familia, a restaurant near Mount Morris Park. He was a bright man who had done a lot of thinking. Unlike Allah, he was not crazy even part of the time. But his thinking had me to believe more conspiracy theories at one time than most people dream up in a lifetime. He had the white establishment, the mafia, the Margaret Sanger, Nelson Rockefeller, the federal government, the Chase Manhattan Bank, and John Lindsay collaborating in 100 schemes to oppress the black man. It took a great many drinks and long conversations before John Lindsay was taken provisionally off the list. I never was close to Kenyatta as I was to Aloud and Murphy. He was personally a more private person. He never indicated how he supported himself. He was supposed to be receiving checks from a construction company, but his hands had fewer calluses than my own. He didn't look like a man who spent much of the day doing heavy labor. I assumed he was hustling the federal government for money, but that was only a guess. Kenyatta gave me some good advice toward the end of the summer. I had decided that I would move to Harlem and got an apartment in Lenox Terrace, a large building where many of the middle-class blacks and politicians in Harlem lived. There was less and less reason for keeping my old apartment. Since I disliked it, it was full of old memories, and I was spending most of my time in Harlem. I felt ready to put down some roots again. I signed the lease and I was waiting for my furniture to be delivered when Kenyatta advised me to change my plans. Although I was home at 127th Street with many of the neighborhood people, I was having trouble with the black establishment, and Kenyatta felt that having the mayor's man living in Harlem would create more problems than it would solve. After thinking it over, I agreed with him and gave up the lease. Kenyatta was a political animal, very shrewd. Ironically, dealing with militants in Harlem continued to be far easier for me than dealing with more established leaders. For years, black politicians acted as brokers between the mayor and the community. They had been the ones to show up at public functions, the token blacks, and they had dispensed local patronage. In a crisis, though, most couldn't wield any more influence over the constituencies than most white leaders could over theirs. As our June meeting in Gracie Mansion had proved, the less time we spent in conference rooms and the more time we spent in the streets, the better off we'd be. As a result, my presence was resented by the more established leaders. CORE was looking for some program funding, for instance, and refused to talk to me. They wanted to deal directly with the mayor. If those leaders had reached all the Alouds and the Kenyattas, I don't think they would have found them so offensive. As it was, I saw my first interest as mobilizing elements of the community to head off destructive summer crises. The politicians and anti-poverty groups seemed more interested in their own game. A political attitude was expressed by the 5 neighborhood boards. A spin-off of the Harrio Act was ostensibly worked to create black political structure in Harlem. They rarely got anyone elected, couldn't deliver votes, and at best the program spread some money around to the people it employed. In August, I got a strongly worded memorandum from them, the gist of which was that in case of riot, the 5 neighborhood boards would encourage residents to protect the women and children, whatever that meant, but they would take no action to prevent or cut short the disturbance. That was not their role, they said. It was the established leadership that made it fashionable to push riots as expressions of racial unity, as revolutionary acts, which in fact was never the case, from the safety of their Lenox Terrace apartments. The memorandum said they were interested in funding projects, but in a riot situation, they took no responsibility whatsoever. It was an outrageous statement. These are the same sort of people who sit in bars like Jocks and the Red Rooster and talk about how Whitey's screwing them. While they're busy blaming the system and having another drink on it, somebody will come into the bar and peddle the merchandise looted from another black man's store, and they will buy it. Records, dresses, dashikis, radios, stolen credit cards. They're sold in the best bars and the worst bars in Harlem. The only difference is at the Glamour Inn, the goods were poorer in quality. At Jocks, you could buy the best of anything. Every once in a while, and David Offer Kriegel would tell me that it was all very well for me to spend time with oddballs like Allah. If I was smart, I'd mend some political fences. So I'd go to Frank's on 125th Street or Jocks, convincing myself that those bars couldn't be as bad as I remembered, and each time would come away thinking that they were worse. Once I was approached by Jocks by a well-dressed man with a smooth approach who I knew to be a poverty pimp. He spent his working hours ripping off poverty programs. I wasn't eager to spend time with him. He had heard that I was Mayor Lindsay's man in Harlem. He knew, he said, that I couldn't know Harlem, not the real Harlem. He challenged me to come with him to meet a poor little old lady he knew. She did her best, but the rats scared her at night, so she slept with the lights on. She lived off grits and bacon grease, and a neighbor saved for her, and she couldn't have money for rent. If I talked to this plucky old lady, then I could say I knew Harlem. I imagined him on the telephone. We've got a live one. Get ready for a visitor. We're gonna hustle Whitey. So I waited until he finished his line, and then I said, if you want to see Harlem, I'll take you to a cellar on 127th and 7th Avenue. I'll show you the Harlem I know. What got to me was that if there was a disturbance, I knew this man would not be out there helping to cool down the neighborhood. I would rather rely on 5%ers than on political hacks and poverty program grifters. If I ever managed to run into this guy, he'd probably still be sitting in jocks trying to get a hustle going. Once I was listening to the third or fourth person in a night wearing a newly grown afro and well-cut suit telling me I didn't know what it was like to be black. I said, of course I don't. God, just look at me. So what? So I stayed where I was comfortable and I got my job done. It took me a moment to concentrate on what Murphy just told me. You get down to the project and I'll call the police, I said. I misdialed once, then twice. My hands, which are usually steady, now shook. My body was still half asleep, but my brain was racing. Allah, that madman from the Glamour Inn who couldn't believe he died, become one of my closest friends, was dead. First Kenyatta, now Allah. Who would be next? What the hell was I doing in the middle of all this? Then suddenly the policeman was on the line, speaking matter-of-factly, in a flat tone. Yes, the story was true. Allah had walked toward the elevator on his way up to visit his wife Dora and was blown apart by 7 of the 8 shots that were fired by one or more unknown perpetrators. By the time the police got to him, he was lying dead on the floor door of the lobby. The shots had smashed into his chest, back, and legs. What was left of the body had been removed by the time I reached the Martin Luther King Towers, but I saw the elevator splashed with blood and the irregular chalked outline where his crumbled form had sprawled, and I knew this wasn't all a bad dream. The photographers had left, but a number of policemen were still checking over the hallways. The rear wall of the elevator was dented by a bullet, and an area bigger than a man's fist was pressed a full 4 inches by the force. On the floor, left behind like a bleak souvenir, lay a shard of bone. I walked outside the lobby alone, very cold, fighting against the acceptance of what had just happened, and suddenly tears were pouring down my face, and I vomited into the hedge. Murphy arrived. Then I went upstairs to talk to Allah's wife and his children. I called 2 secretaries from my office, 2 black women, and asked them to come and stay with the family. It was now 7 in the morning. The police told me that as yet they had no leads. There was no indication that the murder was part of a plot, no immediate link with Kenyatta's shooting. For all they knew, it was a simple case of robbery gone wrong. I found out quicker than they were with all the gambling that night. I know how he hated to lose. He would set the 5%ers on the winner to grill his money back for him. Maybe the winner had come looking for him. Or it might have been some rival jealousy of his standing with the 5%ers. Allah used to tell me that the young people were often approached by people who tried to buy them off, telling them you can't deal with Whitey. Don't go to his schools. Don't work for him. Stay on the street. Allah told me he'd bat these tempers away like flies. I couldn't know how many of these stories were real and how many were imagined. If even 1/10 of the threats against Allah were actually voiced, there were plenty of people around with a motive. The least likely, it seemed to me, was attempted robbery. I assumed that since he had always sleep over his wife's apartment, someone must have followed him there from the bar. On the way down to the mansion, I picked up a copy of the Daily News and read a huge black headline: Muslim rebel slain in Harlem. Cops fear black civil war. The story that followed quoted some identified police spokesman as saying, "We believe black Muslims have had enough of this splinter groups. We want to do away with them once and for all." The genesis theory, apparently, was that Allah, like Kenyatta, was a former Muslim who no longer deferred to Elijah Muhammad. Throughout the several stories on the murder, Allah was referred as Kenyatta's friend, his associate, or his pal, none of which described their relationship. They were not working together. Kenyatta was not about to worship Allah as God incarnate, and Allah wasn't interested in costuming his followers in mufti and handling them machetes. The 2 men were acquainted with one another and respected their differences. The story, of course, had its effect. Everyone believed it. The Muslims started arming themselves. The 5%ers started arming themselves, and whites throughout the city were terrified. The Black Civil War might take place simply because enough people expected it. We moved quickly. The mayor called a meeting at Gracie Mansion with Larry and Fred Lewson, the chief detectives, and he hit the roof. "I don't give a damn what kind of leads you have," he said. "That kind of story does not get into the papers. You stop those rumors." We never did find out who started the rumors, but we figured that in order to have credibility, the Daily News reporter, he had to be someone fairly high up in the police command. We never found out, either, what fragment of a lead the unknown spokesman based his assumptions on. For all we knew, he was a man with a private gripe, or somebody who liked to pin as many internal plots on blacks as Kenyatta attributed to the white elite. From Kenyatta, you could understand it. From a police department official, it was disgraceful. The police department response took us by surprise. Before we knew it, Lewson had called a press conference and announced a new lead. He came up with a few more unsolved shootings and tied them all together as a part of a 10-man extortion plot. A number of thugs were putting the squeeze on businessmen and civil rights figures, demanding financial support for a fictitious black militant organization. If the victims failed to pay off, the thugs would resort to threats and violence. He hinted that the mafia was behind the scheme and limited the number of facts he revealed because of the sensitive nature of the investigation. Aloud and Kenyatta apparently had uncovered the racket and been trying to protect the rights of the legitimate black protest groups from criminal elements when they were gunned down. By the end of the press conference, Aloud and Kenyatta looked like patriotic Americans defending the Constitution and the right of free speech. It was as outrageous a story as the one about the Black Civil War, and as untrue, but the press bought it. It ran in all the papers, and the Black Civil War theory vanished as it appeared the previous week. I had mixed feelings about the whole affair. The extortion ring story, the blatant example of managing the news, was perpetrated by not some political figure as one might expect, but by the police department. The lies weren't even filtered through another unidentified spokesman, but were delivered straight, faced by the chief of detectives. I didn't like being associated with this, even indirectly. At the same time, those lies got us off the hook. If those early stories had sparked violence, the Daily News would have been the first to take credit for the accurate predictions. It was shabby business. I felt better about the way we reached out to the Harlem community. At the time, Louis Farrakhan, the head of the Harlem Mosque of the Nation of Islam, and I did not know each other very well, although in the next year or two we would become close. I grew to respect him very much. Fortunately, Inspector Waith knew him extremely well and was able to talk frankly with him. He told him the news story was a lie, and the police knew it, and Farrakhan took his word for it. On Saturday the 14th, only hours after the news had hit the street, the mayor and I had met with the 5%ers in their storefront and told them the same thing. I could still not fully accept the death of my close friend, and the mayor felt the loss deeply. On this hot June day, he pushed beyond what mayors usually are expected to do or can do. We were all in our short sleeves and sweating. The storefront was long and narrow and very shabby, and inside were about 40 kids and young adults. Lindsay said, "Brothers, I hope you know the sadness in my heart at Allah's death." He went out to give a little eulogy. His contribution was an important one in these last few years, but especially in the world of education. One by the 5%ers spoke up, and they told the reasons why they loved Allah, and they gave their pledge to work for peace. The only way we can show we love them is to build, is to get our carpenters, our doctors, our lawyers, our painters, our electricians. That's how we show we love them, one skinny kid said. The mayor congratulated the 5%ers who would enter college in the fall. "We aren't looking for war with nobody," somebody said. "Allah, he was love," another boy added. These soft words came from some very tough kids. It was hard to imagine other past and present mayors, the Bob Wagners and Abe Beams, in a similar situation. Lindsay left with the words spoken all around when we had entered. Peace! Passed from person to person with a handshake, as Allah had always demanded. On Monday afternoon, I went to Allah's funeral. Over the weekend, his body, patched together by the undertaker's art, had lain in an open coffin in the Unity Funeral Chapel, the biggest funeral parlor in Harlem, a block west of the Glamour Inn. By chance, none of the bullets hit his face. They put a double-breasted suit on him and arranged a gold crown on his head. 400 people came to the funeral, including several dozen policemen on the job and 7 busloads of youngsters. They came from the Bronx and Brooklyn, as well from all over Manhattan. People sobbed, screamed, fell down in the aisle. Some women became hysterical and had to be carried out. Several people fainted. It was an overwhelming atmosphere. One had the feeling that anything might happen, that someone might flip out and start firing a gun into the crowd. A minister said a prayer and gave a sermon. A girl 5%er led in the singing of a song she had written called Allah. I couldn't bring myself to go to the Ferncleave Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, where Allah was to be cremated. The hearse set out, trailed by the slow parade of limousines, buses, and souped-up ancient cars. 4 hours later, I was at Allah's brother's house for the wake, where everyone concentrated on hard drinking. In the midst of our sadness, we ended up having a party.